And good evening to everyone. I see, as usual, that we've gathered here around this campfire. We've gathered for the camaraderie, like we do. We've gathered to see each other. We've gathered to check up on friends. And we've gathered to tell stories. And to listen to stories. Now, I listen to some of yours, and you listen to some of mine, and that's kind of the way we do it here. Tonight we're going to read some more of The Seventh Man by Max Brand. We're in book 3, and I think we're along about chapter 16. We're kind of in the middle of a standoff and probably a gunfight. This is the good stuff. So, without too much more, get settled, folks. Get your coffee, get you something to drink, sit down, and I'll get started. Chapter 16. Manhunting. As Vic Gregg left the house, the new moon peered at him over a black mountain top, a sickle of white with a half-imaginary line rounding the rest of the circle. And to the shaken mind of Vic, it seemed as if a ghostly specter had come out to watch the tragedy among the peaks. At the line of the rocks, the sheriff spoke. "Gregg, you've busted your contract. You didn't bring him out." Vic threw his revolver onto the ground. "I bust the rest of it here and now. I'm through. Put on your irons and take me back. Hang me and be damned to you, but I'll do no more to double-cross him." Sliver Waldron drew from his pocket something which jangled faintly, but the sheriff stopped him with a word. He sat up behind his rock. "I got an idea, Gregg, that you finished up your job and double-crossed us. Does he know that I'm out here? Sit down there out of sight." "I'll do that," said Gregg, obeying, "because you've got the right to make me, but you ain't got the right to make me talk, and nothing this side of hell can pry a word out of me." The sheriff drew down his brows until his eyes were merely cavities of blackness. Very tenderly, he fondled the rifle butt which lay across his knees, and never in the mountain desert had there been a more humbly unpretentious figure of a man. He said, "Vic, I've been thinking that you had the man-sized makings of a skunk, but I'm considerable glad to see I judged you wrong. You sit quiet here. I ain't going to put no irons on you if you give me your parole. I'll see you in hell before I give you nothing. I was a man, or a partways man, till I met up with you tonight, and now I'm a hound dog that done my partner dirty. God Almighty, what made me do it?" He beat his knuckles against his forehead. "Well, what you done you can't undo," answered the sheriff. "Vic, I've seen gents do considerable worse than you've done and come clean afterwards. You're going to get off for what you've done to Blondie, but you're going to have to live straight afterwards. You're going to get married and you're going to play white. Why, man, I had to use you as far as I could, but you think I wanted you to bring me out Barry? You couldn't look Betty square in the face if you'd done what you set out to do. Now, I ain't oppressing you, but I done some scouting while you was away, and I heard 4 men's voices in the house. Can you tell me who's there?" "Well, you played square, Pete," answered Vic hoarsely. "I'll do my part. Go down and get on your hosses and ride like hell, because in 10 minutes you're going to have 3 bad ones around your necks." A mutter came from the rest of the posse, for this was rather more than they had planned ahead. The sheriff, however, only sighed, and as the moonlight increased, Vic could see that he was deeply, childishly contented, for in the heart of the little dusty man there was that inextinguishable spark, the love of battle. Chance had thrown him on the side of the law, but sooner or later dull times were sure to come, and then Pete Glass would cut out work of his own making go bad. The love of the man trail is a passion that works in 2 ways, and they who begin by hunting will be, in the end, the hunted. The mountain desert is filled with such histories. 3 to 5, said the sheriff. Sounds more interesting, Vic. A sudden passion to destroy that assured calm rose in Gregg. 3 common men might make you a game, he said, glowering, but them ain't common ones. One of 'em I don't know, but he had a damn nervous hand. Another one is Lee Haines. He had succeeded in part, at least. The sheriff sat bolt erect. He seemed to be hearing distant music. Lee Haines, he murmured. That was Jim Silent's man. They say he was so fast with a gun as Jim himself. He sighed again. They's nothing like a big man, Vic, to fill your sights. Daniels and Haines. Suppose you can count off again the rest of your gang, Pete? That leaves Barry for you. He grinned maliciously. Do you know what Barry it is? Well, it's kind of a common name, Vic. Pete, have you ever heard of Whistlin Dan? No doubt about it, he had burst the confidence of the sheriff into fragrance. The little man began to pant, and even in the dim light, Vic could see that his face was working. Him, he said at length, and then, I might have knowed. Him. He leaned closer. Now keep it to yourself, Vic, or you'll have the rest of the boys running for cover before the fun begins. He snuggled a little closer to his rocks and turned his head towards the house. Him, he said again. Columbus, when he saw the land of his dream wavering blue in the distance, might have hailed it with such a heart-filling whisper, and Vic knew that when these two met, these 2 slender small men with the uneasy hands, there would be a battle whose fame would ring from range to range. If they was only a bit more light, muttered the sheriff. My God, Vic, why ain't the moon just a mite nearer the full? After that, not a word for a long time, till the lights in the house were suddenly extinguished. So they won't show up agin no background when they make the run, murmured the sheriff. He pushed up his hat brim so that it covered his eyes more perfectly. Boys, get ready. They're coming now. Matt Henshaw took up the word and repeated it, and the whisper ran down the line of men who lay irregularly among the rocks, until at last Sliver Waldron brought it to a stop with a deep murmur. Not even a whisper could altogether disguise his booming vase. It seemed to Vic Gregg that the air about him grew more tense. His arm muscles commenced to ache from the gripping of his hands. Then a door creaked. They could tell the indubitable sounds as if there was a light to see it swing cautiously wide. They're going out the back way, interpreted the sheriff. But they'll come around in front. There ain't any other way they can get out of here. Pass that down the line, Matt. Before the whisper had trailed off half its course, a woman screamed in the house. It sent a jag of lightning through the brain of Vic Gregg. He started up. Get down, commented the sheriff curtly, or they'll plant you. For God's sake, Pete, he's killing his wife, and he's gone mad. I seen it coming in his eyes. Shut up, muttered Glass, and listen. A pulse of sound floated out to them and stopped the breath of Gregg. It was a deep, stifled sobbing. She begged him to stay with her. He's gone, said the sheriff. Now it'll come quick. But the sheriff was wrong. There was not a sound, not a sign of a rush. Presently, what sort of lass is she, Gregg? All yaller hair, Pete, and the softy blue eyes you ever seen. The sheriff made no answer, but Vic saw that little bony hand tense about the barrel of the rifle. Still, that utter quiet. With the pulse of the sobbing lying like the weight upon the air, and the horror of the waiting mounted and grew like peak upon peak before the eyes of the climber. Watch 'em for sneaking up through the rocks. Watch 'em up close, lads. It ain't going to be a rush. Once more, the sibilant murmur ran down the line, and the voice of Sliver Waldron brought it faintly to a period. 3 of 'em, continued the sheriff, and most likely they'll come at us 3 ways. Through the shadow, Vic watched the lips of Glass work, and caught the end of his soft murmur to himself. All three. He understood. The sheriff had offered up a deep prayer that all three might fall by his gun. Up from the farther end of the line, the whisper ran lightly, swiftly, with a stammer of haste in it. To the right. Ah, there to the right, gliding from the corner of the house, went a dark form, and then another, and disappeared among the rocks. They had offered not enough target for even chance shooting. Hold for close range, ordered the sheriff, and the order was repeated down the line. However, much he might wish to win all the glory of the fray, the sheriff, he took no chances, threw none of his odds away. He was a methodical man. A slight patter caught the ears of Vic, like the running of small children over a heavy carpet. And then two shades blew around the side of the house, one small and scudding close to the ground, and the other vastly larger, a man on horseback. It seemed a naked horse at first, but so close to the back did the rider lean, and before Vic could see clearly, the vision burst on all of them. Several things kept shots from being fired earlier. The first alarm had called attention to the opposite side of the house from that on which the rider did appear. Then the moon gave only a vague, treacherous light, and the black horse blended into it, and the grass lightened the fall of his running feet. Now, like a ship driving through the fog, they rushed into view, the black stallion and Bart fleeting in front, and the surprise was complete. Vic could see it work even in the sheriff, for a latter, having his barrel trained towards his right, jerked it about with a short curse and blazed at the new target again and again, and the line of the posse joined the fire. Before the crack of their guns went from the ears of Vic, long before the echoes bellowed back from the hills, Satan leaped high up. Perhaps that change of position saved both it and its rider. Straight across the pale moon drove the body with head stretched forth, ears back, feet gathered close. A winged horse with a buoyant figure upon it. It cleared a 5-foot rock and rushed instantly out of view among the boulders. The fugitive had fired only one shot, and that when the stallion was at the crest of his leap. Chapter 17. The Second Man. The sheriff was on his feet, whining with eagerness, and with the rest of his men he sent a shower of lead splashing vainly into the deeper night beside the mountain, where the path wound down. "It's done, hold up, lads," called Pete Glass. "He's beat us." The firing ceased, and they heard the rush of the hooves along the graveled slope and the clanging on rocks. "It's done," repeated the sheriff. "How?" And he stood staring blankly, with a touch of horror in his face. "My God, Matt's plugged. Matt Henshaw, what? Clean through the head." He lay in an oddly twisted heap as though every bone in his body was broken, and when they drew him about they found a red mark in his forehead and even made out the dull surprise in his set face. There had been no pain in that death, the second for the sake of Grey Molly. "The other two," said the sheriff, more to himself than to Vic, who stood beside him. "Easy, Pete," he cautioned. "You got nothing agin Haynes and Daniels." The sheriff flashed at him that hungry, baffled glance. "Maybe I can find something. You, Greg, keep your mouth shut and stand back. Hello?" He sent a long call quavering between the lonely mountains. "You yonder, Lee Haynes, do you give up to the law?" A burst of savage laughter flung back at him. And then, "Now why the hell should I?" "Haynes, I give you fair warning. For resisting the law and interfering, I ask you, do you surrender?" "And who are you?" The big voice fairly swallowed that rather shrill tone of the sheriff. "I'm Sheriff Pete Glass." "You lie. Who ever heard of a sheriff come sneaking round like a coyote looking for dead meat?" Pete Glass grinned with rage. "Haynes, you ain't much better than spoiled meat if you keep back. I'll give you till I count 10. "Why, you bob-tailed skunk," shouted a new voice. "You bone-spaving, pink-eyed rat-catcher," continued this particular describer. "What have you got on us? Come out and dicker and we'll do the same." The sheriff sighed, softly, deeply. I thought they I thought that maybe they wouldn't get down to talk, he murmured. But since the last chance for a battle was gone, he stepped fearlessly from behind his rock and advanced into the open. And 2 tall figures came to meet him. "Now," said Lee Haines, stalking forward, "one bad move, just the glint of a single gun from the rest of you sheep thieves, and I'll tame your pet sheriff and send him to hell for a model." They halted close to each other, the 2 big men, Haines in the front and the sheriff. "You're Lee Haines. You've named me. And you're Buck Daniels. That's me. Gents, you've resisted an officer of the law in the act of making an arrest. I suppose you know what that means." Big Lee Haines laughed. "Don't start a bluff, Sheriff. I know a bit about the law. Yeah, maybe by experience." It was an odd thing to watch the 3. Every one of them a practiced fighter. Every one of them primed for trouble. But each ostentatiously keeping his hands away from the holsters. "What we might have done if we'd come to pinch," said Haines, "is one thing, and what we did do is another. Barry was started and off before we had a chance to show teeth, my friend, and you never even caught the flash of our guns. If he'd waited, but he didn't, there's nothing left for us to do except say goodbye." The little dusty man stroked his mustache very thoughtfully. He'd gone out there hoping against hope that the chance might come to trick these 2 into violence, even to start an arrest for reasons which he knew his posse would swear to. But it must be borne in mind that Pete Glass was a careful man by instinct, taking in probable speed of hand and 1,000 other details at a glance. Pete sensed the danger of these 2 and felt in his heart of hearts that he was more than master of either of them. Considered alone. Better than Buck Daniels by almost safe margin of steadiness. Better than Lee Haines by a flickering instant of speed. Had either of them faced him, he would have taken his chance, perhaps, to kill or be killed. For the long trail and the escape had fanned that spark within him to a cold, hungry fire. But to attempt to play with both at the same time was death, and he knew it. Seeing that the game was up, he laid his cards on the table with characteristic frankness. "Gents," he said, "I reckon you've come clean with me. You ain't my meat, and I ain't going to clutter up your way. Besides," even in that dull moonshine they caught the humorous glint of his eyes, "a friend is a friend, and I'll say I'm glad you didn't step into the shady side of the law while Barry was getting away." No one could know what it cost Pete Glass to be genial at that instant. For this night he felt that he had just missed the great moment which he had yearned for since the day when he learned to love the kick of a 6-shooter against the heel of his hand. It was the desire to meet face to face one whose mettle of will and mind was equal to his own, whose nerves were electric energies perfectly under command, whose muscles were fine-spun steel. He had gone half a lifetime on the trail of fighters, and always he had known that when the crisis came, his hand would be the swifter, his eyes the more steady. The trailing was a delight always, but the actual kill was a matter of slaughter rather than a game of hazard. Only the rider of the black stallion had given him the sense of equal power, and his entire soul had risen for the great chance of all. That chance was gone. He pushed the thought of it away, for the time, and turned back to the business at hand. "They's only one thing," he went on. "Sliver, Ronicky, step along, gents, and we'll have a look at the insides of that house." "Steady," broke in Haines. He barred the path to the front door. "Sheriff, you don't know me, but I'm going to ask you to take my word for what's in that house." Glass swept him with a look of a new nature. "I got an idea your word might do. Well, what's in this house?" "A little 5-year-old girl and her mother, and nothing else worth seeing." "Nothing else," considered the sheriff. "But that's quite a lot. Maybe his wife could tell me where he's going. Give me an idea where I might call on him." "Partner, you can't see her." "I can't?" "No, by God." Murmured the sheriff. He watched that big man plant himself, swaying a little on his feet as though posing for action. And beside him a slightly smaller figure, no less determined. "That girl in there is old man Cumberland's daughter," said Daniels. "And no matter what Dan Barry may be, Kate Cumberland is white folks." The sheriff remembered that Vic had said of yellow hair and soft blue eyes. "Leastways," he said, "she seems to have sort of a way with the men." "Sheriff, you're on a cold trail," said Haynes. "Inside that house is just a heartbroken girl and her baby. If you want to see them, go ahead." "She might know something," mused the sheriff, "and I suppose I ought to pry it out of her right now, but I don't care for that sort of pickings," he repeated softly. "A girl and a baby." And he turned on his heel. "All right, boys, climb your hosses. 2 of you take Matt. We'll bury him where we put Harry. I guess we can pack him that far." "How's that?" This from Haynes. "One of your gang dropped?" "He is." They followed him and stood presently beside the body. Aside from the red mark in the forehead, he seemed asleep and smiling at some pleasant dream. A handsome feller in the strength of first manhood. This man who was the second to die for Grey Molly. "It's the end of Dan Barry," said Buck. "Lee will never have Whistlin Dan for a friend again. He's wild for good." The sheriff turned and eyed him closely. "He's got to come back," said Haynes. "He's got to come back for the sake of Kate." "He'd better be dead for the sake of Kate," answered Buck. "Why, partner, this isn't the first time he's gone wild. Don't you see, Lee? Well, he's fighting to kill. He's shooting to kill, and he ain't never done that before. He crippled his men. He put 'em out of the way with a busted leg or a plugged shoulder, but now he's out to finish 'em, Lee. He'll never come back." He looked to the white of Vic Gregg standing by, and he said without anger, "Maybe it ain't your fault, but you've sure started a pile of harm. Look at these gents around you, the sheriff and all. They're no better than dead, Gregg, and that's all along of you. Barry has started on the trail of all of you. Look at that house back there. It's packed full of hell, and all along of you. Lee, let's get back. I'm feeling sick inside." Chapter 18, Concerning the Strength of a Woman. There were 3 things discussed by Lee Haynes and Buck Daniels in the dreary days which followed. The first was to keep on their way across the mountains, cut themselves away from the sorrow of that there cabin. The second was to strike the trail of Barry and hunt until they found his refuge and attempt to lead him back to his family. The third was simply to stay on where they found the opportunity to help Kate. They discarded the first idea without much talk. It would be yeller, they decided, and the debt they owed to Dan Barry of the old days was too great to be shouldered off so easily. They cast away the second thought still more quickly, for the trail, which baffled the shrewd sheriff, as they knew, would be too much for them. It remained to stay with Kate, making excursions through the mountains from day to day to maintain the presence of carrying on their own business, and always at hand in time of need. It was no easy part to play, for in the house they found Kate, more and more silent, more and more thoughtful, never speaking of her trouble, but behind her eyes a ghost of waiting that haunted them. If the wind shrilled down the pass, if a horse neighed from the corral, there was always the start in her, the thrill of hope, and afterwards the pitiful deadening of her smile. She was no less beautiful, they thought, as she grew paler, but the terrible silence of the place drove them away time and again. Even Joan no longer pattered about the house. When they came down out of the mountains, they never heard her shrill laughter. She sat cross-legged by the hearth in her old place during evenings, with her chin resting on one hand and her eyes fixed wistfully upon the fire. Sometimes they found her on the little hillock behind the house, from the top of which she could view every approach to the cabin. Of Dan, and even of Black Bart, her playmate, she soon learned not to speak, for the mention of them made her mother shrink and whiten, Indeed, the saddest things in that house was the quiet in which the child waited, never spoke. "She ain't more'n a baby," said Buck Daniels, "and you can leave it to time to make her forget." "But," growled Lee Haines, "Kate isn't a baby. Buck, it drives me damn near crazy to see her fade this way." "Now you lay to this," answered Buck. "She'll pull through. She'll never forget, maybe, and she'll go on living for the sake of the kid." "You know a hell of a lot about women, don't you?" said Haines. "I know enough, son," nodded Buck. He had, in fact, reduced women to a few distinct categories, and he only waited to place a girl in a particular class before he felt quite intimate acquaintance with her entire mind and her soul. "It'll kill her," pronounced Lee Haines. "Why, she's like a flower, Buck, and sorrow will cut her off at the root. Think of a girl like that thrown away in these damn deserts. Makes me sick, just sick. She ought to have nothing but velvet to touch, nothing but a millionaire for a husband, and never a worry in her life." He grew excited. "But here's the flower thrown away and the heel crushing it without mercy." Buck Daniels regarded him with pity. "I feel kind of sorry for you, Lee, when I hear you talk about girls. No wonder they make a fool of you. A flower crushed under the foot, huh? You listen to me, my boy. You and me figure to be pretty hard, don't we? Well, soft pine stacked up agin quartzite is what we are compared to Kate." Lee Haines gaped at him, too astonished to be angry. He suggested softening of the brain to Buck, but the latter waved away the implications. "Now, supposing Kate was one of these dark girls with eyes like black diamonds and a lot of snap and zip to her. If she was like that, I suppose you'd figure her to forget all about Dan inside of a month, and maybe marry you." "You be damned." "Maybe I am. Them hard, snappy-looking girls are the ones that smash. They're brittle, that's why, but you take a soft-looking girl like Kate, now maybe she ain't a diamond point of cut glass, but she's tempered steel that'll bend and bend and bend, and then when you wait for it to break, it flips up and knocks you down. That there's Kate." Lee Haines rolled a cigarette in silence. He was just too disgusted to answer, until his first puff of smoke dissolved Buck in a cloud of thin blue. "You ought to sing to a congregation instead of to cows, Buck. You have the tune and you might get by in a church, but cows have sense." "Kate will buckle and bend and fade for a while," went on Buck, wholly unperturbed. "But just when you go out and pick a daisy for her, you'll come back and find her singing to the stove. Her strength is down deep, like some of these outlaw hosses that got a filmy, sleepy-looking eyes. They save their hell till you sink the spurs in 'em. You think she loves Dan, don't you?" "I have a faint suspicion of it," sneered Haines. "I suppose I'm wrong." "You are." "Buck, I may have slipped a nickel into you, but you're playing the wrong tune. Knock off and talk sense, will you? When you grow up, son, you'll understand some of the things I'm trying to explain in words of one syllable. She don't love Dan. She thinks she does. But down deep, they ain't a damn thing in the world she gives a rap about excepting Joan. Men, what are they to her? Marriage. That's simply an accident that's needed so she can have a baby. Delicate, shrinking flower, is she? I tell you, my boy, if it was necessary for Joan, she'd tear out your heart and mind and send Dan plumb to hell. You fasten onto them words, 'cause they's gospel." It was late afternoon while they talked, and they were swinging lowly down a gulch towards the home cabin. At that very time, Kate, from the door of the house where she sat, saw a dark form slink from rock to rock at the rim of the little plateau. A motion so swift that it flicked through the corner of her eye, a thing to be sensed rather than seen. She sat up very stiff, her lips white as chalk, but nothing more stirred. A few minutes later, her heart was beating almost at normal. She heard Joan scream from behind the house, not in terror or pain, as her keen mother ear knew perfectly well, but with a wild delight. She whipped about the corner of the house, and there she saw Joan with her pudgy arms round the neck of Black Bart. "Bart, dear old Bart, has he come? Has he come?" And she strained her eyes against the familiar mountains around her, as if she would force her vision through rock. There was no trace of Dan, no sign or sound when she would have even welcomed that airy whistle. A wolf dog was already at play with Joan. She was on his back, and he darted off in an effortless gallop, winding to and fro among the rocks. Most children would have toppled among the stones at the first of his swerves, but little Joan, she clung like a burr, both hands deep into his hair, shrieking with excitement. Sometimes she reeled and almost slid at one of those lightning turns, for the game was to almost unseat her. But just as she was sliding off, Bart would slacken his pace and let her find a firm seat once more, then wound farther and farther away. And suddenly Kate cried terror-stricken, "Joan, come back!" A tug at the ear of the wolf dog swung them around. Then as they approached, the fear left the mind of the mother, and a new thought came into its place. She coaxed Joan from Bart. They could play later, as she promised, to her heart's desire, and led her into the house. Black Bart followed to the door, but not all their entreaty or scolding could make him cross the threshold. He merely snarled at Kate, and even Joan, tugging at his ear, could not budge him. He stood canting his head and watching them wistfully while Kate changed Joan's clothes. She dressed her as if for a festival, with a blue bonnet that left the yellow hair curl out from the edges, and a little blue cloak, and shiny boots, incredibly small, and around the bonnet she laid a wreath of yellow wild flowers. Then she wrote her letter, closed it in an envelope, and fastened it securely in the pocket of the cloak. She drew Joan in front of her and held her by both hands. "Joan, darling," she said, "Mummer wants you to go with Bart up through the mountains. Will you be afraid?" A very decided shake of the head answered for her, for Joan's eyes were already over her shoulders looking towards the big dog, and she was just a little sullen at these unnecessary words. "It might grow dark," she said. "You wouldn't care?" Here Joan became a little dubious, but a whine from Bart seemed to reassure her. Bart will keep Joan," she said. "He will, and he'll take you up through the rocks to Daddy Dan." The face of the child grew brilliant. "Daddy Dan," she whispered. "And when you get to him, you take this little paper out of your pocket and you give it to him. You won't forget." "Give the paper to Daddy Dan," repeated Joan solemnly. Kate dropped to her knees and gathered the little close until Joan cried out, but when she was eased, the child reached up in an astonished hand, touched the face of Kate with awe, and then stared at her fingertips. A moment later, Joan stood in front of Black Bart with the head of a wolf dog seized firmly between her hands, while she frowned intently into his face. "Take Joan to Daddy Dan," she ordered. At the name, the sharp ears pricked. A speaking intelligence grew up in his eyes. "Get up," commanded Joan, and when she was in position on the back of Bart and she thumped her heels into the furry ribs. Towards Kate, who stood trembling in the door, Bart cast the departing favor of a throat-tearing growl, and then shambled across the meadow with that smooth trot which wears down all other four-footed creatures. He was already on the far side of the meadow and beginning the ascent of the first slope when that glint of the sun on that yellow wildflowers flashed on the eye of Kate. It all seemed natural until that moment, the only possible thing to do. But now she felt suddenly that Joan was thrown away. The thought of the darkness which would come soon, remembered the yellow terror which sometimes gleamed in the eyes of Black Bart after nightfall. She cried out, but that wolf dog kept swiftly on his way. She began to run, still calling, but rapidly as she went. Black Bart slid steadily away from her, and when she reached the shoulder of the mountain, she saw the dark form of Bart, with that blue patch above it, drifting up the wall of the opposite ravine. She knew where they were going now. It was the old cave upon which she and Dan had come one day in their rides, and Dan had prowled for a long time through the shadowy recesses. Well, there you are, folks. Kind of an interesting part of the story. Thought there was going to be some more gunplay, but seems like Dan's out to get every one of them, maybe one at a time. I bet you it'll come down to him and that sheriff. There might be a good play. Well, we'll be talking about that in a week or two, won't we? And until next time I talk to you, you guys all be good and gather up the little ones. Love them. Till then, this is Clay Steele. Be good.